good evening, and welcome to this very special live stream public discussion about crying for justice, a project that I have pretty much self-driven for the last 3 years, and besides small bits of support for today's live stream, a partnership with the Castle of Good Hope and the Imam Harun Foundation as well. Otherwise, basically, this has been a self-guided initiative, and the program for this evening will basically be that I will be giving an introduction. We will then have contributions which have been pre-recorded from two members of the Imam Harun family, as well as the CEO of the Castle of Good Hope. Then we will go to some live contributions from a number of speakers, and we will have a Q&A which is on the YouTube chat on the side here. We'll take questions throughout, but they'll only be answered at the end of the program. So without further ado, I will begin this live stream. I was reluctant to call it a launch because it's a public artwork and the work's been up in public for the last few years, but I am very much proud to be putting this work out into the public and having the work off my shoulders alone and into another dimension. Crying for Justice actually started 10 years ago with a work that I did called Amongst Men, and I continued that with collaborations with Imam Harun's family, and I was invited as one of the people that were responsible for organizing memorialization in his 50th year after his passing in 2019. And we came up with this idea, wild idea, which would be to create a graveyard, a sculptural graveyard of 118 unmarked graves, one for each of the people who were killed at the hands of the apartheid security police in detention. And this imagination then sent us on a chase for a site. There were two potential sites. The one was in City Park in Athlone, close to where I grew up, and the other is and actually opposite the road from Imam Harun's house, where he was taken and then eventually killed by the security police from that place. Or we found this place, the site at the castle, and it's a parking lot on the corner of Darling and Burton Street and Castle Street, that starts at that point as well. And I then had the responsibility to figure out how to fit 118 graves onto a site and still make the point that I was trying to make. And the point that I was trying to make was a cry to the heavens, right? And actually a cry to the courts, which are alongside the site. A cry to the courts for the truth and for interventions in the cases of these apartheid policemen who killed our people and whose families still have to live with the fact that their loved one or their family member slipped down the stairs or hung themselves when actually they were murdered and they were killed. So this idea of crying for justice and making this broad statement out to the heavens being a sort of undertaking that just took really 9 months of my own doing with my best friend, where we lined out all these graves very meticulously and then started digging and spent like 3 weeks just raking stones in a kind of Zen-like training, somehow sharpening my sword. And I then got interrupted by lockdown. we had a small team on site after the first 6 months we were working on our own. The last 3 months we got 2 people helping us, and lockdown stopped us. And somehow, 2 years later, all of these graves were still intact. They hadn't caved in. They hadn't. The earth edges hadn't, given in. There was some thing that was protecting them. Fast forward to this point where we've now got some signage. We've got a little bit of support from the Western Cape Department of Arts and Culture and the Castle of Good Hope and the Ministry of Defence, who made a viewing platform so people can view the work with dignity and safely. I've now opened this live stream public discussion as a way to also, talk about not only the work but also some of the things that are happening, some of the cases that are happening, a little bit of the background into the TRC and how our settlement that we have to live with today began. So the speakers tonight will address some of these issues, as well as a sort of thought about really how do we memorialize in a world where you haven't had justice in the cases, right? So if it was up to me, of course I want the work to be removed one day. I want there to be justice in all of these cases. I want there to be actual victories. But until then, there's a crying need for a space like this to mark what an absolute injustice it is into society, that we still have to live with these lies. Steve Biko did not die from head injuries. Neil Agate did not hang himself. So until we get a turnaround, there's a need for a citizen-led public installation of public artwork that you can view, that you can bear testament to what a crying injustice it is for us to not have closure or even any kind of truth in these matters. I can talk about what a huge undertaking the work was, but I can also maybe leave some of that to the question and answer time at the end, where all of the speakers as well as myself will be available to answer questions. I've got quite a complicated live stream set up that I'm going to be manning as well. But I suppose it's important to say, in this project, I kind of managed to do it all on my own. And I think that's also part of it. It's like, how do you teach yourself basic broadcasting? How do you get a small grant from a youth development agency and get a camera and then learn how to put together a setup like this? So I am very much honored. And the last acknowledgement I also need to make before moving on is that I was at home, working at home for the last week with my old computer, trying to edit the footage and edit the live stream, and it just wasn't working. And I reached out to Bertha House, and I've been in the pleasure of this edit suite for the last couple of days, as well as a great internet connection, so I know this will be a stable stream. And I'm kind of very honored for all of the supports that I've received. We also have got, we have still got coming up musical interludes by a wonderful young jazz musician named Nobuhle Ashanti. We had a waiting room that was filled with her work, and we will hear a little bit more about it later. So I really thank you as well for that. And I suppose my first speaker, who I have the pleasure of introducing, is Comrade Mother Shirley Gunn. And I suppose Shirley's speaking tonight in her capacity not only as my mother, but as the chairperson of the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice, who tonight's live stream is a partnership with. All of the members are friend members, I believe, besides Shirley, who's the chairperson, and Kylie, who is a friend but not yet signed on, Kylie Thomas. So without any further ado, I'm going to open up with Shirley's contribution that was live, that was recorded a week and a bit ago at the Castle of Good Hope. So thank you. And I stand here on this contested land in front of probably a life's work, which I'm very proud to introduce you to. But it's a piece of land that since the 1700s has never had a building on. And I don't know, somehow in that historic trajectory, when I approached this man right next to me, who is the CEO of the castle, and I said, I'd like to do this piece of messy, transitional memorialization for a past that's unresolved. I was met with, wow, well, it's right next to the site of historic gallows where people were hung, right behind us here. And it was part of the decolonial project here at the castle to also revise its history. So I found myself fortuitously able to negotiate that piece of land for this work that I'm now going to explain to you. And I have to take it back 10 years. Okay? 10 years ago, I was invited to be part of an exhibition at the Center for African Studies gallery called The Three Abdullahs, focusing on Tawan Guru, who is one of the first slaves and a resistance leader, Imam Abdullah Harun, who I am named after, and Abdullah Dollar Brand, right, our famous jazz musician. And this exhibition forced me to have to think about something that I've thought about my whole life, but never in the mode of response. Like, what do you have to say about that? Like, what does it mean to be named after Imam Harun? I mean, firstly, I'm not enclosed in. I'm not a man of the cloth. Let me say. I was never raised with much religion. In fact, I was raised by two communists who just religion. What? Okay, but I'm named after an imam, but not because of a religious sense, but because I'm from the community. My father was born in Claremont. The imam was his imam, and he witnessed Imam Harun's coffin being lowered into his grave on Mowbray Cemetery on the other side of this hill, and as a 12-year-old, he swore vengeance. Quite like I did a few minutes ago. As an angry young person, he said, I will not accept this. And he joined the armed struggle directly as a response to seeing Imam Harun having fallen down the stairs in a building that has a single step. Why should we accept this? Why should we accept this history that's a total lie? Imam Harun didn't die, he was killed. And to this day, the historic record says he died, as did Steve Biko, Neil Agate. It moves me beyond sadness to actual anger. And I'm working with your mother, Khalima Harun, who passed away on the day of Imam's death 50 years later. And I came up with a piece which is called Amongst Men, which is made up of kufiyas, Muslim prayer hats suspended at the angle, the height and the tilt of the men at Imam Harun's funeral. This mass of bodies that you see under the kufiyas, it's the most spectacular work, and I don't mean that to say I've done something spectacular, but it is what it is. It's really special. Has got James Matthews' voice, our anti-apartheid stalwart poet's voice, ringing out over this installation, asking whether Imam Harun died as a patriot or as a terrorist. And we still don't know the answer to that. What a tragedy that we still aren't able to say he was an absolute martyr. He was killed so that we can be here and be free. fast forward to 3 years ago, and it was the 50 years of Imam Harun's killing, and I was invited, and actually until that point was the biggest honor in my working career. I was invited by the family to sit on the organizing committee for the 50-year commemoration of Imam Harun's death. And I'm there with imams. I'm there with distinguished people in the community. And I'm like 29. And I have a responsibility. I get given the responsibility of how do we memorialize this? There were other people that were doing different commemorations. That was my responsibility. And we came up with an idea of creating a graveyard of unmarked graves that beg for the opening of inquests and for the truth for the families and for our society at large. We came up with this idea of a graveyard. How it would work was another story. Where it would live was another story. At first we were looking at a place in Athlone called City Park, right next to where the Harun family residence was. But then we found our way here, to the castle, and the most appropriate location, because this site was firstly unused, not that it's not used for parking, but it was, what you see behind you looked totally different 3 years ago. It was gravel, right until 2/3 of the way through. And I had first drawn it up as a very neat architectural plan. Okay, it's quite a complex mathematics. All the graves face Mecca. Couldn't make just Imam Harun's grave to face Mecca or just Ahmed Timmel's grave. So all of the graves face Mecca, and they step up one by one and somehow manage to fit the site perfectly in that configuration. It reads justice, which is a cry to the heavens. It's really a cry to the heavens. But not really. It's a cry to the courts, which are just alongside here, in that brick face building you see behind us. It's a cry to the courts for us to have an intervention in the unanswered cases, in particularly at that point in Imam Harun's case, since that's where it started. But it became much bigger, because this was about 117 people who were killed at the hands of the apartheid security police. There are 118 graves, one extra, because that 117 is by no means the truth. And there were those who survived and who were tortured to hell and gone and still live with that part of themselves dead in the living world. So there's 118 symbolic of that. We were then trying to get a sponsor, as one does. And so the date of the commemoration came closer, and there was like, wow, what you gonna do? And I was provoked. By the CEO of the council, who said, well, can't you use little sticks and little strings and then a spade and just do it? So I said, okay, I can try my best. I can try. So I got little sticks, lots of them, and all the string that I could buy in the whole of this downtown. And it took us 6 months, myself and my best friend, to meticulously measure out, then remove the grass, regrow the grass. We spent 3 weeks just raking stones in a process of zen on the one hand, but it really, for me, it was like grinding my axe. It was like being there, working hard, knowing that there's just months and months of hard graft ahead of you was the most humbling experience of my life. And then came a producer on the corner, and he said, hey, Harun, what are you doing? I'm like, hey, I'm digging a graveyard here. So he said, don't you want it to be part of the Infecting the City public arts program? No budget, just on the map. So November 2019, we committed to do an unveiling. It was much rawer than it is now, but it was something. Then we had a second preview which was to the VIP guests of the Cape Town International Art Fair in February of 2020. And then my team stayed on site, pushing along, trying to make an unveiling for March 21, Human Rights Day 2020. However, lockdown stopped that. And the most remarkable thing happened. I think I came here for the first time 6 or 7 months after lockdown, and everything was still there. Not one of the walls caved in, not one of the graves looked any different to how I'd left it, and today it looks pretty much as I'd left it at the start of lockdown. So there's something, call it a spiritual presence, call it a righteousness, call it a struggle that's keeping this piece here alive. And instead of picking it up again, I got another invitation to do another exhibition on the other side of town, and I ran at it, even though there was no budget once more. But that took me a whole another year cycle to find myself here today, finally unveiling or launching this piece off like the world off Atlas's shoulders. I feel I can somehow hand it over, or hand it over, or hand it over, and birth it into the world, and somehow, I don't know, let it become a public space and a public artwork and a memorial, citizen-led initiative. So I'm very fortunate to have had a tiny bit of support from the Western Cape Department of Arts and Culture to have the launch and to do a little bit of site dressing, and I'm also very, very excited to say that later in the year we'll be working on a bigger project, an exhibition inside that will link this as one of the experiences in a broader exhibition, really looking at the castle's role in the transitional justice space that we live in here in South Africa, and responding to a couple of the ghosts that haunt this very building.
I was never sentenced, but I have had long stints in solitary confinement, and that last grave, that 118th grave, it could have been ours. So when I experienced you going off every morning with calloused hands and sunburnt skin, digging another grave, of course I was thinking about our history, our collective history, and it was very difficult actually observing you. And you know, some people have asked me if I'm proud of you. Proud is absolutely not the right word. I respect you so much, and so let me just come back to a little bit about the site, east, west, sorry,
East.
No,
West. East, that's
east, east,
yeah.
east, west. That's where the sun sets.
Yeah.
That's where it rises.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Now, over there, that building is where Parliament is seated now, because our Parliament burnt down at the beginning of the year. And that balcony over there that you can see is where Nelson Mandela gave his first speech. We were still in the underground at that moment, because although as freedom fighters you would think we would be celebrating with the whole country, we were not free. In fact, that period up until the first election was the most tricky, and when the most people died actually in the country, because there were great attempts to actually roll back our gains. And our gains had everything to do with the armed struggle, with the mass democratic struggle, with the international solidarity, and with the political aspect. So there were 4 legs to our struggle. and I was involved in one of them, the hard one, the very hard one. So it's also historical. So I will bring back to a little bit about my activities as a freedom fighter. This place in the 80s was a headquarters of the South African Defence Force that was maiming and killing left, right and centre. And I managed to pass the soldiers with a limpet, a Russian-made limpet mine in a custard box, through the soldiers, through the entrance, to the tea room, where I do my last bit of reconnaissance. And then eventually, because of the number of people around, I entered into the middle section. There's a line dividing these 5 corners, down the middle, into the archway, left it there. I got out of here, threw the flowers in the bin that I bought at the flower market up the road, which was a fabulous cover because I could hide my face behind it. Threw it in the bin, jumped on a bus, and went to Clifton, where I met up with your father, Harun, Anis, and we watched the news. And I think this was a great embarrassment to the South African Defence Force, that somebody could have actually penetrated the heart of its operation. But now I begin to think they could have suspected anyone, and they probably also had a long list of the workers that were on there that day. And not only have thought about this white woman that came in sunglasses and a sun hat and a bunch of flowers, but I would have been seen by somebody, because there were so many around, going into that tunnel. And it made a really loud noise. So that was one of the operations. And our objective was always to avoid civilian casualties. And there were no casualties that time. Coming back to this marvelous intervention, and I think you've got something to say about that noonday gun that has just hit at 12 o'clock. So, good. No, you do. Because I know you did something up there as a student. So maybe that's a story you can tell as well. No? Okay. Despite its...
subordination in the ranks.
Okay. Well, I think we've got a little bit of hope on the horizon, actually, as we stand here. 2 weeks ago, in the High Court, there was a finding that Dr. Neil Agate, who I actually knew, did not commit suicide on the 10th floor at John Foster Square, as was found in the inquest in 1982 by a magistrate, Khotsa, and he was found with a kukoi and a Kenyan cloth hanging to the bars of his cell, and they said because he had shared information about his comrades, he had committed suicide. The family, his comrades, the workers who worked for the Food and Canning Workers Union never believed this, we never believed this, but it was actually 40 years later that the truth emerged. And so I think, the symbolism of digging each and every grave, I do hope, Muhammad and Fatima, that we do get to the bottom, the truth behind the killing of the Imam, and soon. And I want to ask you again, don't give up. It seems like such a bitter journey to have to endure as the next generation. Like Harun has this bitter journey. But we're nearly there. We're nearly there. And I think for the nation, in fact for the world, we owe them and everybody the truth. We need to have that truth. So I appreciate the depth of these ruler-length graves, and because it's unlevel, they go a little bit beyond a ruler from at certain points. But because, you know, unfortunately, the responsibility of unearthing and finding the truth is rested with civil society and family and victims, and the state, the South African state, has allowed itself to be to be interfered with. The courts have been interfered with. The politicians have interfered with the courts. There has not been good investigation of all the TRC cases that were handed over on a damn platter to the National Prosecuting Authority. There was interference. We have found that. That's established. And we have to find out how that happened and who's accountable for that interference, because that cannot happen in a democracy. It cannot happen, not on our watch. And so it's a long struggle, and it's not one that only Harun or me or the Harun family. Sorry that I drained tears to your eyes. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It's all of our struggles. It's everybody. It's for you to take home with you, and everybody here. And so this is why I'm so behind you, Harun, that this work has a platform. It's given the space in the world that it needs for everyone to understand that our struggle continues. Thank you.
Harun, you must be admired for not shying away from truth and justice. Your personality and character allows you to be outspoken through the window of your artwork, but more importantly, from the parents you came from what they instilled inside of you, from the core of your being. This echoes specific context in our South African history, a country that finds its way through transforming justice. Harun is always determined to be outspoken when he witnessed social challenges, and he adheres to his grassroots activism. Harun depicted this installation, I'm talking about Amongst Men, where he conceptually recreated the funeral of our father, a young man, Harun, an artist who thought of this amazing idea to depict it, to bring it to life form into an art exhibition or a space where people can get that feeling of, you know, reinventing or reincarnating that moment of the janaza, the thousands of people that came to his funeral. My brother, 13 years old, along the sidewalk, not recognized as the child of this amazing person that died, was also left on the sidewalk, left alone. I always looked out for his picture at the funeral. I see family, friends, but never saw his face because he was left on the side. So that pain, Harun, that you have when you did that installation, it resonates still deep down in my brother's heart, which he doesn't speak about it today, but I will speak about it because I was only 6 years old when our father was killed. It was at that funeral that Harun felt that he needs to put together Amongst Men to show that my father was murdered by the apartheid police in September of 1969. Harun had mastered the art of storytelling through creating installations in open spaces. He has always been passionate about recreating truth for justice. Today we stand here, we witness again another installation that Harun has carved with his own hands through sweat, tears and blood and hours as a justice-loving person. To ensure that memories is our weapon. Crying for justice, as we witness here today. Yet again, Harun has not only collaborated with the Harun family, but with everybody else that helped to make the space happen, especially from the castle. And the little bit of teeny weeny amounts of money that came in to help him survive and struggle through that agony moments when I was maybe sleeping, everybody else was unaware of his tears flowing down his face. He should be recognized for this amazing installation. It's worth your while to come and view, to the viewers of this launch, and read the marked or unmarked graves of so many who had died for a better South Africa. In this space at the castle has an important history, because as Harun had mentioned before, it was the gallows where people were hung and killed at this space. So it's apt that the open graves were designed to be here at this space, so that we can't forget, as you're standing here, the very people, the slaves that were unfairly, unjustly treated, killed, tortured to death at the gallows for the fun, at the expense of their perpetrators. Harun's creativity has immersed a sculptural graver from above, and the graves spell out justice. Today, we as the children of Imam Harun, we're still waiting for this ANC government to reopen the inquest into the death of our father. How much more time do we need from the President, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, that you ensure that the justice is served after almost 53 years into the death of our father? How long must we wait, not only us, all the victims across South Africa, wherever they are, that our inquest must be reopened? We demand today publicly, we had enough waiting. It is through the artwork and the artists such as Harun that takes his time, his energy, his last breath, his sweat, to get it remembered through installations such as these, as what we are witnessing today. This is not a game. This is our lives. Our family, our victims' family group are still waiting on answers. We've written more than 3 letters to the President Muhammad to ask him to reopen not only the inquest of our father, but so many of all the victims. Too many names to mention. Does this president have no ethical and moral feelings towards all the families who lost their loved ones, and not who lost their loved ones only, but those that suffered the tyranny of apartheid? I mean, here Shirley next to me, she bears testimony of what she had to endure, the torture, and so many that are still alive. So many. They are still carrying that burden, that responsibility, that heaviness on their shoulders. Harun, I want to thank you as an artist, and of so many of you that are here today that are artists. Your work will never be unrecognized. But what I admire from you, Harun, is your courage that you never gave up. Your mother just said to us now, amazing mother you have. You know what the beauty is, you can still speak to your mother. I never had a chance to speak to my father. I was only 6. You can still have a fight, you can still have love, you can still have different issues, but you have this opportunity. I never had it, and I never will. Many times I pray that I can, like you said, the last installation, you asked me, what would you say to your father if he had been alive? I would say to him, I love you. What more can I tell him? I can't say come back, because he's never going to come back. I never had to say that to him. I never said it to him because I was 6 years old. And then when I was 6, he was so busy in the prime of his political career trying to fight justice to gain freedom for all of South Africa and of humanity. I thank you so much, Harun. You need a standing ovation, not only for this piece of work you've done, but for all the pieces of work you've done. Not only about Imam Harun or the Harun family, but all the other pieces you've done. And I would believe, I don't know the history, but you did it with sweat, tears, and blood, and angry frustration. No money. My God, how do you survive? But you know what? You are blessed. As you said, the graves are still there, still the same 2 years ago. It never, there were so many storms. You would have imagined it closed up. But you know what? Take the good out of the bad. You were truly blessed. We are blessed to know you through your parents and your mother. And we are blessed that we can witness today the impact and the effect you will have on society, and that's in the future to come, our youth.
I think Harun has done us a great service, and again we have to thank Calvin and his team for giving us the opportunity here, because the castle itself has so much symbolism and so much memory that you just don't know where to start. And I think Calvin shared some thoughts with us. The mere fact that the gallows were here, it says much. What do we know about the gallows? What do we know about the stories of those people who were killed? What do we know about the stories who were exiled, those individuals who were exiled and who had to die here, being hanged without their families having any knowledge of what they had gone through? But we know in all oppressive communities and societies or under autocratic governments that all those individuals who stood up for justice, who stood up for change, for positive change, they were killed in a very brutal way that is also unimaginable to describe. We basically, that is partly the reason why we feel that one way to express these, and what Harun does on behalf of us all, is to use his creative mind and to basically share ideas through creativeness. And so the previous installation he had was just another way of honoring the Imam. It was a way of honoring him, but a way of reminding us, memorializing an event that we had to seriously think about. In other words, why was he killed in the way he did? What did he stand for? What was the purpose of his work? And of course, just down the road, we have Caledon Square, where he was detained for many months until he was taken to another sort of area outside sort of this sort of sector, where he was eventually killed. And then he was also taken on occasions to outlying areas like Tilbach, where the earth tremor had really had an impact on the night he was buried. But having said all of that, and I think there's much more to say, let me just say this to that. In terms of memory, I think you've helped us to just stimulate us again with this installation. And not only us, but I think if it's shared with many others via the audio, via sort of television, I think it will basically help to just jog them and to think about what it means to be just individually, communally, familially, and of course nationally, because we all need that concept in our lives, in whichever form, but we need it. We need to be associated with it. We need to say somebody, A, B, or C, in our case our father, in our case the Biko, in our instance sort of others who basically were killed, that they did so because they wanted to bring about social justice.
What this installation is doing is to anchor us into all the historic layers of injustices, and that the struggle aluta continua. That we should never forget that it must go on and on and on. Now I'm trying to keep like this diplomatic face and whatever, because if you an employee of, because I'm representing a state of, arm of the state. So what do you call it, a public entity. So I have to play this role. Deep in your heart, in your being, you are a social activist, but you also have annual report, you also have to report back to Parliament, you report to a board. So it's that balance, and God forbid, for the past 10 years, I could strike that balance where people like Chanel could come in, Shirley could come in and say, Comrade CEO, we must do this and this and do that. It's just for me to say yes first, and then determine the parameters in which we can do that. So there we have it. Harun, there was supposed to be a question mark also. I remember we were toying with the idea of a question mark to say that the quest for justice is a never-ending, ongoing fight. And especially what makes it difficult, and Sally will tell you, is this negotiated transition, where a large part of the womb of a deep colonial oppressive system were dragged along into the new. So you had many officials who were still maintaining that the old structure. I'm not justifying it, because now we are almost 30 years beyond. We should have got rid of all those old faces. So when the two, and I met Harun, Professor Harun at university where I was teaching in geography, and he was teaching, what is this thing called? Hebrew, or no, not Hebrew. He was one of the what we call foreign languages, and such a humble person. And when his sister talked about this 12-year-old, who nobody noticed, and she's trying to find photos because they were almost denying, society denied that there was this 12-year-old son, whose father was killed, and he needs to carry on without fully comprehending what's happening around him. Imagine how difficult it must be for him to deal with that.
My name is Shirley Gunn, Harun's mother, but I am here as the chairperson of the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice. We are engaged in all aspects of the unfinished business of the TRC. If I were to summarize: truth, justice, reparations, accountability. And the coalition consists of 13 organizational members and currently 14 individual friends. And we have recently, last month, had our AGM, and will be launching as an entity on its own, with its own legs and heart and head, still with all the partners, but independently. So this is a lot of work that we have on our plate, unfortunately, but we will persist. We will never give up. I have the pleasure of introducing the 4 speakers who are coming one by one. And the very first speaker tonight, guest speaker, is Mary Burton. So I'll give you a little bit about Mary's background. I think many of us know her. And Mary, forgive me if I pronounce your second name incorrectly, Mary Ingoville Burton, born in Argentina, educated there and in Brazil, and then settled in Cape Town after marrying Jeff Burton, her husband. Towards the end of 1993, Mary became a South African citizen just in time to vote in 1994, and she served as the provincial electoral officer in the Western Cape province. So in her 20s, I was trying to calculate, in Mary's 20s, mid-20s, she joined the Black Sash and held various positions in the Black Sash, becoming its national president in 1986 in the thick of the struggle. Mary is currently a member of its board of trustees. In 1995, Mary was appointed by then President Nelson Mandela to serve as a commissioner on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In fact, when I testified to the Truth Commission, Mary chaired that hearing at the University of the Western Cape in the Great Hall. I can say many other things off script about Mary, but let me just add one more little bit of detail, is that Mary authored this book. It's one of the Jacana pocketbook history books on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was authored in 2016, and then the second impression was last year in 2021. As Haroon has already said, Mary is an individual member of SACTJ. Mary, I would like to hand the mic over to you.
I would like to begin with congratulations and good wishes to Harun. It's wonderful to be with you virtually, and I hope that we will be able to hear each other at Bertha House, such a wonderful new site in Cape Town. This site-specific installation at the castle in Cape Town is highly evocative. It's deeply moving and a powerful contribution to the memorialization of these cruel and tragic deaths in our very recent past in South Africa. I hope it will be a success in every possible way, making people aware of it and calling people to visit the site, leading to interest and public discussion, and achieving wide respect, both for the artistic aspect of the installation and for the impact that it has as we think about the past and the cruelties that were inflicted on so many people. This work of memory and accountability is an important part of all our lives, not only in this country, but in many other places as well. Honoring those whose courage and belief took them into making enormous sacrifices is important. It's important for inspiration, for ongoing courage, ongoing commitment to the work that has to be done. Forgetting or giving up would be an act of betrayal to those who gave up so much. We learn these lessons from other parts of the world, like Germany, which goes on struggling with its own past, like countries in Latin America, and many Eastern countries whose stories we don't even know well enough in this part of the world. And in this country, the young generation has a tendency to feel aggrieved that they have to take on this burden of remembering the past. But it's important because as we try to build a better society in South Africa, we can't do so long as we are hampered by the lack of truth, the lack of accountability for what has been done in our name and in the name of future generations. Honoring the heroes is vital, and it is the role of artists to keep on sustaining this, and of museums and of archives, so that the records are not lost and the stories are told. And that, to me, is one of the great successes of the Truth Commission, that we have managed to record in that very hefty 7-volume report all the cases which came before us, the ones which were investigated, and the ones which still remain to be concluded for lack of being able to prosecute those. Another way of remembering these things is to remember some of our national heroes. And one of them, of course, was the recently passed away Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And the exhibition which has just been opened in the foundation in his memory is also a way of paying tribute to all those. And one of the most moving items in that exhibition is the entire list of names which was published by the TRC of those who were found by the TRC to have been victims of violations of their human rights. So all this work is absolutely vital to keeping the past alive. Now, this installation speaks of a specific category of people who died in the most cruel and inhumane way while being held for often very long periods under probably very, very severe torture and interrogation, which led to their deaths. Other speakers this evening will be talking about the struggles after the life of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to pursue justice in cases where the prosecutors have managed to, the perpetrators have managed to evade justice, having been not been granted amnesty for their deeds. And it also speaks, there will be people talking about the need for reparations. At this stage in our history in this country, I believe that it is also absolutely vital to look at other things we must remember and to talk about redress for the past, as well as reparations for individual human rights violations. We need to remember that ever since the colonial period, people in this country have lost their land, have lost their rights, have lost their homes under a whole series of inhumane pieces of legislation. We still see in the poverty and unemployment and inequality the impact of that legislation and those events. And we need to build a just society for all our citizens, for those who are poor, for those who are young and not achieving adequate education. And if we can build the kind of society where people all have equal rights and equal opportunities, that will be the best form of redress and reparations and justice for the future. I think I've come to the end of my time, so that I leave our discussions at that point.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm so glad that you said everything that you did. It all had to be heard, and coming from you, thank you very, very much. I introduce the next speaker. I'm sure that there'll be many questions asked of you, Mary, at the end, so hang in there, please. Yasmin is our next speaker, and Yasmin has a very long legacy as well. Yasmin is a human rights lawyer and served as a commissioner on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, appointed by Nelson Mandela in 1995. She currently chairs the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, established by the Human Rights Council in Geneva to investigate serious crimes in South Sudan and collect and preserve evidence for future accountability efforts, and recently published a report on conflict-related sexual violence. Yasmin served as one of 3 international commissioners on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Sierra Leone, appointed by Mary Robinson. In 2011, Yasmin served as an advisor to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, as a member of the panel of experts on accountability for war crimes in Sri Lanka. In 2015, she served on the Secretary General's panel investigating sexual exploitation and abuse by French peacekeepers in the Central African Republic, or CAR. She also served as a member of the high-level advisory group on the Global Review of Resolution 1325. Yasmin is the current chair of the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa, and as I mentioned earlier, she is also an individual member of the South African Coalition for Transitional Justice. Thank you for joining us tonight, Yasmin.
Good evening, everybody. or good morning, depending on where you are, or good afternoon. But let me at the outset congratulate Harun for this really important installation, and for bringing alive the issues which we grapple with almost on a daily basis. When I, listen to Harun and to Fatima and Mohammed and Shirley, it struck me that the words that we constantly have to confront are denial, denial of the truth, and really find the struggles to recover that, the absence of justice and accountability for victims, and of course the question of reparations and redress. And the denial of that truth, of course, denies closure for the families of apartheid victims, and of course for the next generation who then have to take up the struggle. We also deal, I think, with the collusion of the former apartheid state at the highest level in the commission of what I would call atrocity crimes, torture, killings, massacres, enforced disappearances, and conspiracies to commit these crimes. And while we have seen one indictment under the crime of apartheid, in reality, no one in our country has ever fully been prosecuted or convicted for apartheid crimes. And as I was watching the installation, it reminded me of the death of one young man, Stanza Bopape, a 27-year-old activist who was abducted, he was tortured, he was killed, and his body was then disposed of in 1988. And initially, when the news spread that he had disappeared, the security branch denied that they'd abducted him, and they also denied that they were responsible for his death. We only found this out because the Argentinian forensic team, who had been busy digging up graves in Zimbabwe, were told by the president then, Robert Mugabe, who is now late, to leave the country. And we were able to secure that they come to South Africa to assist us, as a policeman was pointing out where his grave could possibly be. But of course we dug and we didn't find his body. And that's what tonight's exhibition reminds me of, the fact that there are so many bodies out there that the families don't know of. They don't know of where they've been disposed of, where they've been buried, and if the remains are still there. And that makes it very difficult for closure. In the case of Stanza Bopape, the Human Rights Violations Committee issued a subpoena to the policeman who had been implicated in his abduction. And on the morning that they were supposed to appear at a hearing, 2 lawyers came in and told us that 10 of their clients would be applying for the amnesty for the death of Stanza Bopape. And those people included the former Minister of Law and Order, Adrian Flock, a man who goes around washing the feet of victims, but without disclosing the truth. The minister, he was the minister at the time, and the head of the police and a number of security personnel, ranging from brigadier generals to ordinary security branch policemen. They told us that Stanza had died on the table as he had a weak heart. But they didn't say that, in fact, the torture that they were perpetrating on his body was, in fact, what gave rise to his death. They later told us that they had taken his body to the Komatipoort River and they had disposed of it there. The Truth Commission actually sent a team out with a general who was said to have disposed, the guy who cleans up after everybody else. And we made him carry a kind of, what are these replicas with the same dead weight the Stanza's body would have been. And we asked him to carry it out of the boot of the car, and he couldn't do that. And he couldn't even lift it and throw it into the river. And so very clearly he was lying about what he had done. And of course, we took readings of the water levels. We took readings of when bodies had washed up, and there was nothing around this period. And so it was very clearly denial and lies. But it reminds me also then of the last 23 years, where at the Foundation for Human Rights and through the support of the legal team led by Howard Vani and a number of pro bono legal firms in South Africa, as well as our key investigator who is now late, Frank Dutton, and our current investigator, Cliffy Marion, of how we have supported the quest for the search for the truth, not only of the Harun family, but many, many others. And to be frank, they don't know where the bodies are, and it's impossible for them to move on. And that is why it is so shocking that the democratic state that we elected into power has colluded in the suppression of the truth, as is now confirmed by various courts in our country, including the Supreme Court of Appeals, where they have confirmed that there was a deliberate suppression of investigations of cases that emanated from the work of the Truth Commission. The neglect by the National Prosecutorial Authority and the police in not investigating these cases and not indicting perpetrators while still fresh wounds to the families and forces the fact that they now have to carry the burden of searching for the truth. Even as we speak tonight, there is no clarity from the NPA on the cases they are dealing with. And it has only been through the pressure of families placed by them through litigation that, in fact, we have brought many of these cases to the fore. It is a shameful story, really, of the new South Africa and its neglect of those who gave up their lives for the freedom that we enjoy today. And that is why the architecture tonight of the sculptural graves is such an important way of remembering, because as we know, memorialization and art play an important role in truth recovery. And where they are, the castle is such an important symbol of our colonial past, and a reminder that neither the colonial government or the apartheid government have made redress or acknowledged the truth of the past in terms of those they oppressed. Many of the leadership of the apartheid government, like former President de Klerk, went to their graves without telling the truth about what happened. And in fact, land remains a major issue of contention in our country. And while the government did pay out a measly sum in reparations to victims, I think there are at least another 8,000 victims who didn't get that reparations, and community reparations remains outstanding. But what is important here is that as we speak, both the families of victims and perpetrators are dying. More recently, in the case of Nokuthula Simelane, who was abducted by the security branch and killed, her aunt, who was a key witness in the case, passed on. And at least 3 of the perpetrators in that case passed on. In the case of the Timor matter, where we rejoiced when the inquest court was set up under Judge Billy Motley ruled that Ahmed Timor did not jump from the 10th floor, but that in fact he had been murdered by the security branch. And we had one perpetrator indicted, but sadly, he also passed on. And so after all of that jubilation, the family feel incredibly let down. A few weeks ago, thanks to the sterling efforts of our legal team, in the case of Neil Agate, a trade union activist and a medical doctor who had also been said to have committed suicide, the inquest court ruled that in fact there was no possible way that he could have taken his own life, and that in fact he lost his life at the hands of the security branch. And in fact, the judge said that The matter needs to be investigated, and those responsible should be held accountable. And yet, many weeks later, we are told that they're still studying the judgment. And quite terrifyingly, some of the most notorious torturers may walk free simply because the state has taken too long to do anything about it. That in itself represents a grave miscarriage of justice. And that is why this art installation of graves, the symbolic notion of bodies and where they have been buried or where they have been destroyed, is so critical to our struggle for justice, which still carries on. And for that, I thank you, Harun. It's such an important piece of work. And I would urge everybody who can to actually go and view it. Thank you. And that is why this art...
Thank you very much, Yasmin, for your input. For all the detail and for your personal contribution, which has been so consistent, so dependable. Thank you very, very much, Yasmin. I hand over to the next speaker, Howard Vani. He's been mentioned by Yasmin, and many of you know Howard, but let me go ahead with a short bio. Howard is a senior program advisor for the International Center for Transitional Justice. His areas of expertise include truth-seeking, national prosecutions, institutional reform, reparations, and public interest litigation. Howard is also a practicing advocate at the Johannesburg Bar. His legal practice includes human rights, constitutional, and administrative law. In the early 90s, Howard was an attorney with what we call LRC, the Legal Resources Centre in Durban, where he represented victims of political violence in public interest litigation, judicial inquests, and commissions of inquiry. In the mid-90s, he led an independent criminal investigation in South Africa into organized political crime, which resulted in significant criminal trials. He worked with the South African Truth Commission as a consultant on a range of matters. Howard was the chief investigator for the Sierra Leone Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He assisted the Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation in Timor-Leste, with the compilation of its final report. As a consultant for ICTJ, Howard has assisted with the development of transitional justice initiatives in several countries in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, the Americas, and the Balkans. He continues to represent victims of past conflicts in the courts of South Africa to vindicate their rights. Thank you, Howard. Over to you.
Thank you, Shirley, and thank you, Harun, for the invitation. I also wish to pay tribute to you, Harun, for your literally backbreaking work in keeping the memory of so many martyrs alive. I know that families and communities really respect this work that you do in bringing home what has happened. And the need for justice, as your project says, crying out for justice. So, Harun, you did ask me to focus on the Neil Agate case when you first sent me the invite to participate. So I've decided to draw on the closing arguments in the Neil Agate inquest and to speak about a few of the extracts from those closing arguments in the 15 minutes that that I have, and I hope in doing so to bring home that case, and of course to pay tribute to the life and times of the late Dr. Neil Agate. So a young promising life was cut down in the early hours of 5 February 1982. Neil's short life was a selfless one. Notwithstanding his privileged upbringing, he dedicated himself to working for the most vulnerable in society. But his choices deeply offended those in authority. They viewed his choices as the ultimate betrayal, worthy of vindictiveness and unrelenting brutality. Their malice and cruelty led directly to his death. The first inquest decision of Magistrate Kotzer, that nobody was to blame, was the product of a deeply flawed legal system. It was the product of a conspiracy by the police to subvert justice and deny the truth to the Agate family and the nation. It was the product of intimidation. It was the product of a corrupt magistrate and prosecutor who were willing to avert their gaze from the truth. In short, it was the product of a brutal police state. Neil's parents, Aubrey and Joy, and brother Michael went to their graves without closure. They had to live and die with a manifestly false official finding that nobody was to blame for Neil's death. The Agate family and Neil's partner, Liz Floyd, his friends and comrades had to wait some 38 years for the inquest to be reopened. Now, it must be asked, why did it take that long for the state to act in this case, and indeed many other cases arising from the apartheid era? Liz Floyd, who was detained with Neil, she testified back in 1996 before the Truth Commission, and she called on Agate's interrogators to come forward and speak the truth, but none did. The Truth Commission, of course, made findings against Stephen Whitehead and other security branch officers, and yet the post-apartheid police and prosecutors were not moved to act in Neil's case and hundreds of other cases. Indeed, the TRC referred hundreds of cases to the NPA in which amnesty was not applied for or denied, including the Agate case. Until the last few years, these cases were not pursued. The responsible institutions essentially sat on their hands and pretended that investigations were proceeding when they were not. We now know why the cases from our past have not seen the light of day in courts of law. It has emerged in recent court proceedings, starting with the Nokuthula Simelane case in 2015, and in the Rodriguez case in the last few years, that powerful elements in society shamefully colluded to ensure the suppression of the cases referred by the TRC to the NPA. And as Yasmin mentioned, last year the Supreme Court of Appeal dismissed former apartheid policeman Jean Rodriguez's bid for a permanent stay of his prosecution for the 1971 murder of Ahmed Timol, saying it was perplexing and inexplicable why these cases were suppressed, given the guarantee of prosecutorial independence of the NPA, its constitutional obligation to prosecute crimes, and of course the interests of victims and survivors of those crimes. Now, sadly, many of these cases cannot be revived. Suspects, witnesses, and family members have died. The harm visited upon those families and their communities is incalculable. They deserve nothing less than a full and open and public commission of inquiry as to how and why justice was denied to them. In the Agate case, the Agate family have been cruelly denied much accountability and truth. former Lieutenant Stephen Whitehead, the lead interrogator and tormentor of Agate, died on the 22nd of April 2019, in the very same week that the Minister of Justice announced the reopening of the Agate inquest. He was only 62 years old at that time. And I should add that we in fact had to threaten litigation to get this could have been helped out if the authorities had done their jobs under law and the Constitution and not succumbed to political pressure to abandon these cases. Perpetrators of apartheid-era crimes have taken their lead from the state's inaction. They know they have nothing to fear. This explains why, with a few notable exceptions, former security branch witnesses paraded before the reopened inquest and continued with their charade of innocence, just as they had done before the inquest court in 1982. It was as if nothing had changed. They did not have the slightest concern of having to face the music for their lies and deceit. That is the price that families and communities must pay for the readiness of our law enforcement authorities to trash the rule of law at the behest of powerful political forces. So South Africa's post-apartheid criminal justice system has failed the Agate family and hundreds of other families as well. The Agates had to wait some 40 years for an accounting with the past. And hundreds of other families are still waiting for truth, justice, and closure. We should pause to pay tribute to those young men and women who stood up to the apartheid state and who were terribly abused in detention, including our own Shirley Gunn, who's with us today. But in the Agate case, it included Liz Floyd, Barbara Hogan, Feroz Kachalia, Frank Chakani, Prema Naidu, Jabu Ngwenya, Ishmael Mamoniat, Cezanne Jakalana, Oret van Heerden, Sidney Mufamadi, Ibrahim Ishmael Ibrahim, Maurice Smithers, Gavin Anderson, Keith Coleman, and many others. Some of them testified in the Agate inquest and had to relive the horrors of their detention. We salute their courage. We were grateful that there were some former security police officers who were willing to come forward and speak the truth of what took place in John Vorster Square in the 1980s. In doing so, they had to break free from the security branch brotherhood, which demanded total loyalty and silence. And we should highlight them: Joan Yampula, Manamana Maketa, and Paul Erasmus, for shining a light on those dark days. And in particular, we're grateful to our investigator, Frank Dutton. It was his painstaking investigation which opened the doors to that case. And sadly, he died just a few weeks ago. He will be sorely missed. South Africa is a much poorer place without people such as Neil Agate, Steve Biko, Nokutula Simelane, Ahmed Timol, Imam Harun, Matthew Ganiwe, Fort Kalata, Speram Conte, Tekelo Mashlali, Hussein Hafaji, Ashley Creel, Rick Turner, Dulcie September, Matthews Mabalani, and many others murdered by the security branch. Their sacrifices paved the way for our freedoms. In these turbulent times, we could have used their wisdom and guiding hands. We take inspiration from their short lives. Neil Agate was not willing to live a lie. He refused to cooperate, rather to compromise on the truth, even if it meant his own demise. He believed that he could rely on the truth, that he had not committed any crime and was simply working to advance the workers' struggle for social justice. However, he came up against the uncompromising wall of the security branch, comprised of thugs, too incompetent and vacuous to fathom between fact and fiction. Security branch officers Stephen Whitehead and Arthur Cronwright would only be satisfied with a full confession, which would have required Neil to live a lie, a step he was not willing to take. This invited even greater abuse from insecure men out to prove themselves. They vented their fury on a defenseless man they believed had betrayed the supremacy of white people. However, Neil's enduring dignity and humanity remained intact till the very end. Neil would have known why he was in John Foster Square. He would have known that his unassuming and quiet resistance to racial domination and his methodical building of a trade union movement posed the greatest threat to his tormentors. He would have known that others would pick up where he left off, and they would not stop until the pernicious system of apartheid was swept aside. Neil's memory is treasured by freedom-loving South Africans. He remains an inspiration to young South Africans working to make a difference in society. His contribution to a free and democratic South Africa lives on. Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you, Howard.
Unmute.
It is. Thank you, Howard. I just want to check here, Harun. I cannot see everyone. I'm seeing it's slightly changed.
Okay. I see because Kylie is showing
Oh, I've got you. The next person lined up is Kylie Thomas. And Kylie's got a few slides to show us. And that's why for a moment I was disorientated. Let me give you a little bit of a background. Kylie is a senior researcher at the Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam. She writes about photography, visual activism, feminism, queer and anti-racist movements, resistance and protest, and South Africa during and after apartheid. She is the author of Impossible Mourning, HIV and AIDS and Visuality After Apartheid. That was published in 2014, and she's the co-editor of Photography in and Out of Africa, Iterations with Feminist Challenges, that was published in 2020. Her articles include Digital Visual Activism, Photography, and the Reopening of the Unresolved Truth and Reconciliation Commission cases in post-apartheid South Africa, which centers on the apartheid activist Ahmed Timol. Kylie, you are the next person to take the mic.
Thank you, and thank you so much for this invitation. It's really an honor to be speaking as part of this forum alongside those who I admire so much. And I'm going to speak about how visual activism in South Africa can and has been linked to judicial activism, both to redress the violence of apartheid and to force the hand of the state in ensuring that the rights guaranteed by the Constitution are fulfilled. And I understand visual activism to operate as a call that links those who look and those who act, and to narrow, even sometimes close, the gap between them. And I think that Haroon's work is exemplary in this regard. And I'm going to speak a little bit about the work itself, particularly for those who have not seen the work or don't know the context. And so in 2019, on an open piece of land adjacent to the Castle of Good Hope in Cape Town, a huge fort designed by the Dutch colonists and built by slaves between 1666 and 1679. Haroon Gunn-Salie spent 6 months creating an immersive sculptural graveyard of 118 unmarked graves. The wide grassy stretch was once the site of gallows, where an untold number of people were tortured and executed during British and Dutch colonial rule. Gunn-Salie's intervention brings this repressed history to light and links the long history of colonial violence to that of the apartheid regime. Each empty grave symbolizes one of the 118 people who died in detention while in custody of the security police during apartheid. Although these graves are no more than holes in the ground, they evoke the painful experiences of the family members of activists who were killed and who continue to wait to hear the truth about how their loved ones died, and for those who killed them to be held to account. This installation formed part of Infecting the City, an annual public arts festival held in Cape Town. And I quote from the website of the Infecting the City site, and from Haroon's words, it's intended both as a space of contemplation and as a call for justice to be done. When seen from above and viewable from the elevation of the castle walls, the installation spells out the word justice, a cold reminder of the need to dig up the past and continue the fight for unresolved matters of transitional justice. Haroon's intervention at the site of the castle is also a deeply personal work, the title of which, Crying for Justice, invokes his own traumatic experience as one of the youngest victims to have been tortured by the security police. And Shirley, his mother, here with us today, was an anti-apartheid activist and member of Umkhonto we Sizwe. And while she was pregnant, she was falsely accused of the bombing of Khotso House. And that was a building in Johannesburg that housed the World Council of Churches and numerous other anti-apartheid organizations. And after the birth of her son, Harun, they were detained together for 64 days. And in fact, in Shirley's testimony at the TRC, she relates how the security police had played recordings of Harun's crying to her when they were separated as part of her torture. This work by Haroon is a timely intervention. In 2017, a landmark verdict was passed in the reopened inquest into the death of anti-apartheid activist Ahmed Timmel, who had ostensibly committed suicide while he was detained by the security police at what was then John Vorster Square in 1972. And his family were forced to wait for more than 40 years for the truth to be told about how he had died and for his killers to be called to account. And as we've already heard, in 2017, in the landmark hearing, Judge Billy Mokhle found that he had not committed suicide, but that he had been tortured and murdered by the security police. And the verdict in this case has opened the possibility for other unresolved cases of activists who were detained and killed under apartheid to be reopened and for apartheid era perpetrators to be tried. But as Howard and Yasmin have made clear, this is not an easy path. The Timmel case is one of more than 300 instances of gross violations of human rights committed during apartheid that were meant to be pursued when the South African TRC drew to a close, and which have been suppressed as a result of political interference. And the fact that they are being reopened now has come about only as a result of the tireless campaigning on the part of family members of those who were killed and the organizations who have supported them. And that includes those who are speaking this evening. Since the reopening of the Timmel inquest, images of activists detained and murdered during apartheid have re-entered public space, both as part of news articles relating to the cases and through the work of visual artists and activists. The interventions of visual activists are particularly important in relation to instances where states have sought and seek to render their own practices secret and opaque. And this includes forms of violence that are rendered invisible or that are extremely difficult to monitor and track, such as enforced disappearances and the torture and murder of activists in prison cells or in other sites, clandestine sites. In South Africa, after apartheid, social justice activists have employed visual activist strategies to draw attention to the persistence of structural racism and inequality, and also to these long ongoing struggles for justice. And they've made use of visual activism to great effect. And this includes the powerful work of the Treatment Action Campaign, for instance, which won a protracted battle against the state that brought about access to antiretroviral treatment in the public health sector for people living with HIV in 2003, and of equal education, a grassroots movement, which began in 2008, and that's mobilized for thousands of young people to claim their right to equal education, and of several initiatives that have fought for justice in the aftermath of the Marikana massacre of 2012. And all of these campaigns combine awareness-raising strategies, including visual activism, with skillful use of the law as a tool to secure social justice. And this image here, this is part of the social justice organization Section 27's campaign, advocating for adequate and safe sanitation in schools and justice for the family of Michael Kamape. And they made use of poignant hand-rendered portraits and photographs of children who had died in the most terrible circumstances, who they drowned in pit toilets, to draw attention to this otherwise invisible crisis. And so I see Haroon's work working in this kind of frame. Visual activism provides a point of access, a way of summing up socio-political contexts and events and making it possible for outsiders to glimpse something of the complexity of lives that are not their own, even to find ways to connect and to respond. Yet the presence of signs on the walls of a city, however incendiary, or of works installed in a gallery or even public art installations, sometimes that lead us to question or that move us to tears, cannot and do not bring about social justice on their own. Sometimes these works act as a catalyst, and when they spark movement, it's because of the ways in which the visual is connected to other forms of activism, including the kinds of organizing that often remains unseen. Visual activist practices play a key part in provoking, documenting, and sustaining struggles for justice, and remain as critical today as they were during apartheid. As Haroon Gunn-Salie's work makes clear, visual activism operates as a summons, a call to move beyond visual modes of engagement, looking and watching and seeing, and instead to rise up and act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kylie. That was fantastic. I've been reading this book, and so much of what you're saying, I have picked up in the book, very agreed. But I think that art and activism includes more than just what's visual. It's audio, it's sensory. And so I think that Harun also incorporates multi-sensory layered layers of work in his work, which I think adds volumes. And I think, you touched on it. What moves us? There is so much information. We've heard so much from Howard. We've heard so much from Yasmin. The facts, and Mary. The facts. What moves us beyond into action? Sometimes it's that very visceral. It's that emotive. It's that visual that transforms our understanding into action. So I think that all these layers of our work need to work together in collaboration artists and activists and advocates and all of us together, I think we have together can make a difference. And that's why this type of arrangement, or with the type of inputs that we've heard tonight, I think makes that connection of how vital it is for human rights lawyers and advocates and human rights activists like Mary, myself, and visual artists like you, and Haroon's broader contribution, which is beyond visual only, come together. Then we've got, then I think we can start stirring the pot and mobilizing and building that ground force, because we can't do it alone. We need that movement for change. And Mary put it so well. We have got so much work beyond the resolutions of the Truth Commission. We've got the resolutions of our democracy, the things that we voted for, all the areas that are still yet unfulfilled. A real sharing of land, of equality, of dignity. It's not happening in this country yet. We have a long way to go. So no further am I going to talk. I'm handing over to you, Haroon, because I think you can see some of the questions your side.
How it actually started was with a drawing, right? And I had quite meticulously done a site plan for Crying for Justice, where actually all of the graves faced Mecca. I couldn't make just Imam Harun and Ahmed Timmel's grave face Mecca, so I made all of the graves face Mecca. So that points to 37 degrees. And from that I was able to take the E, the S, and step the justice up on the site in a way that made mathematical sense, geographical sense. And I handed over this plan to the foundation, and I said, well, please get someone to dig the graves. I've done my job. And there was no pickup, there was no sponsorship from what I was hoping, like a landscaping company. And a month, 6 weeks went by, and provoked by the CEO of the castle, actually, I was asked, well, can't you just take little sticks and string and then a spade and just dig the graves and do the project? And I said, well, I suppose I can. And I bought out all of the string in downtown Cape Town at a point, and it took about 3 weeks of just measuring and then painting the lines, and then came the hard work, which was to remove the grass and then excavate, and I mean, quite literally 3 whole weeks went by, and all we did was rake stones and rake stones and rake stones. When you look at that image, Crying for Justice, basically the whole thing was a gravel parking lot, and the graves at the bottom and the graves at the top, the grass I removed, I then replanted in the parking lot to make to grass the rest of the site. And yeah, it was a very physically exhausting project.
I'll have a stab, and then perhaps others can chime in. In fact, look, it's a very good question, and we don't have a definitive answer as yet. Of course, we have some ideas, and we do have some evidence that we have uncovered as to what transpired. But in fact, it's one of the reasons why we have called on Cyril Ramaphosa to establish a public, open and transparent commission of inquiry into what caused the suppression of several hundred very serious murder investigations, massacres, assassinations, enforced disappearances, kidnappings, torture, and the like. Until we get a public commission of inquiry in which the relevant role players can be subpoenaed and can appear and answer tough questions, and in which family representatives can be given the opportunity to present their evidence and cross-examine the individuals who played a role in the suppression at the time. We're not going to get to the bottom of this. But we do know from evidence that we have led in the Nokuthula Simelane case, as well as the Rodriguez matter, we have a sense of what happened. We know that cabinet ministers instructed former NDPP Vusi Bokoli to down tools in relation to the TRC cases. And when he had the temerity to go ahead with just one matter, the attempted murder of Frank Chakani through poisoning, he was relieved of his duties. And Anton Ackerman, who was then head of the PCLU, who wanted to go ahead with one or two other matters, he was also taken off those cases, and the rest is history until we threatened litigation and went to court in Nokuthula Simelane and a few other cases. We simply haven't been able to get any movement. Bokoli in his affidavit did mention one potential reason, and that is he was told in a nighttime meeting at the home of a cabinet minister, in the presence of various cabinet ministers, he was told bluntly by the late Jackie Salebi that if he proceeds with cases against the apartheid era generals, that then opens the door to cases against ANC members, and that was unacceptable. So he was bluntly told to stop. There are other theories. Other people believe that a deal was done involving, security elements from both sides in order to extract the assistance of the army and the police in dealing with the far-right threat in the mid-1990s. A deal was made that they wouldn't be pursued. They wouldn't have to face justice. We've heard from F.W. de Klerk himself that there might have been some kind of arrangement that was struck. But until this commission is established, we can only speculate. We have some evidence, but we don't have the full story. And as I mentioned in my address, the families, the communities they come from, the nation are entitled to know what happened. Because of these 400 odd cases that were handed over, except for a handful, they're all dead and buried. They're not going to be resuscitated. So the damage has been done, and it's permanent damage. The very least South Africa can do is give those families answers and explain what happened so that we can make sure this never happens again. We've heard from the Minister of Justice that, yes, he is going to establish an inquiry, but he has in mind an internal inquiry, not a public, open, transparent inquiry, not an inquiry that we can follow on a live feed or we can attend, not an inquiry where we can put questions. He wants to somehow give it some credibility by bringing on board a retired judge. From the best of my knowledge, I believe he hasn't been able to find a retired judge who's been willing to discredit him or herself by getting involved in an internal inquiry in which you have members of the executive investigating themselves. So that's the Surrey story.
No, I think that Howard has said it all, but I think what's really striking is that 23 years have passed since the commission handed over these cases to the NPA. And as Howard points out, we learnt about the suppression through the affidavit of the former head of the NPA, Vusi Piccoli, who was courageous enough to take a stand. And I think that raises a question which the Supreme Court of Appeals and the full bench in the Rodriguez appeal made, that the NPA simply did not have the courage to do its job in terms of the Constitution and the act establishing it, in that it should have acted with independence. And, what it has done is prejudice the rights of families to the truth. And in a way, it doesn't only constitute a dereliction of duty and another form of political victimization, but it's also a travesty of justice, and it's a miscarriage. And in that context, I think somebody has to be held accountable. And so it's not only about setting up a commission of inquiry, but it's also about families demanding, I think, redress from the state for what has been done to them. South Africa doesn't really have a history of justice and accountability, particularly in terms of institutions that were captured. And what we certainly can see was that the NPA and the police in the form of the Hawks were captured, and somebody has to answer for that. It's another form of capture, it's corruption, and the disservice that it has done to victims, I think, is deadly, in the sense that there are so many cases that will not be pursued. And for that, the state has to answer. And so what civil society and the ordinary South African should be doing is writing to the president to demand that he sets up an independent commission of inquiry, not setting up a retired judge in that position. Thank you.
Typing, the D and the C are very close to each other. And I wrote dying for justice, not crying for justice. And somehow that kind of I asked this question, how can this mistake happen? And we are dying for justice. People have died for justice. But we cry. And is crying a whimpering? Is a cry a shout? It's a call, but it's painful. And that's just the last word I wanted to add here. We are crying for justice now.
Thank you very much. And once again, congratulations to you, Harun, for this installation, but also for reminding us of how important a contribution art can be to this work around memory, and really not to forget, which I think is such a huge way of dealing with denial. But I think we need to remind ourselves that the struggle for justice in our country is not over. And the families of victims need all of the support they can get. And in that, we should remember the incredible work of the late Frank Dutton, and the sterling work that is being done by our legal team, which is led by Howard. So thank you to everybody, and what a pleasure to participate in this. Thank you.
From my side, I also want to conclude with saying to Haroon to keep up the good fight. It's an exceptionally good fight to wage. It's a fight we may have to keep fighting until we breathe our last breath. But nonetheless, I think it's well worth the struggle. I think the work you're doing in the art terrain is incredibly important. It helps to move people in a way that at the judicial or legal level, we're unable to do so. So we rely on you to help move people, both at the individual, the personal level, but also at the national level. Thanks again.
Thank you. So yeah, I've been reflecting on this echo that we've had with us during this. You know, it's partly a technical glitch, but also the importance of hearing. And Mary is not here to say something at the end, but it was duplicated in her speech. Her voice came to us double, and I just think about the important role that she played at the TRC. And in the struggle against apartheid, and that she was here with us this evening was very important. And I think that we cannot hear these things often enough. So we actually need this reiteration, even when it's sometimes traumatic.